The lighthouse keeper's secret, Ashford Point, Maine. Population 1,400. A small coastal town where the tide sets the clock, and the lighthouse has watched over the harbor for more than a century. For generations, fishermen here trusted its steady light to guide them home. And for more than 30 years, one man kept that light burning, Thomas Hale. By all accounts, Thomas was the picture of dependability early riser, quiet neighbor, and a man who never once missed his evening rounds. But in the summer of 1986, something happened that shook Ashford Point in a way no storm ever had. The day the light went out, it was the morning of July 18th, when the mail boat captain noticed something strange. The lighthouse was dark. Not just the main beam, but the smaller lanterns along the walkway. That had never happened before. By the time the Coast Guard arrived, Thomas Hale was found inside the lighthouse quarters, slumped in his chair near the logbook. The entry for the previous night was unfinished. The official report? Natural causes. Heart failure, most likely. The town mourned quietly and moved on. But over time, certain details began to surface, details that didn't quite fit. The first questions, the most puzzling part, was the logbook itself. Thomas's handwriting was known for its neatness, but the last entry was hurried, almost unreadable. And in the margin, there was a faint pencil sketch of something. A triangle, a dotted line, and the letters Ds. No one could explain it. The page was never photographed. And before long, the logbook was stored away in the archives. For most, the matter was settled. For a few, it was the start of a story they couldn't stop thinking about. The present day, nearly 40 years later, investigative journalist Clara Whitmore arrives in Ashford Point. She's here to write a feature on historic lighthouses. At least, that's what she tells people. But Clara has another reason. She's been carrying a letter, one that arrived at her office 6 months earlier. It read, "If you want a real story, ask about the night Thomas Hale died." The light didn't fail. It was turned off. There was no signature. The Ashford Point Lighthouse had been a constant presence since 1883, its beams sweeping across the harbor every 12 seconds, night after night, storm after storm. To the fishermen, it was a lifeline. To the tourists, a photograph. But to some, it was a tool. A tool that, if used in a certain way, could send a message. The keeper's code, before automated systems took over, a lighthouse keeper had full control of the beam, including the ability to adjust its timing. A slightly longer flash, an extra pause, a short burst. These could form a pattern. To the casual observer, it was nothing. To someone who knew what to look for, it could be a code. Locals recalled whispers from the early 80s. That late at night, on certain weekends, the Ashford Point light didn't follow its standard rhythm. It would change, just for a few minutes. And each time, a certain fishing trawler would come into the harbor at dawn. Rumors and records Clara Whitmore dug into the public archives. She found nothing official, no incident reports, no Coast Guard notes, no complaints filed. But in the back room of the town library, she found something else. Old shipping logs kept by a retired dockmaster. The logs showed that 3 different vessels had entered the harbor in 1984 and 1985 without scheduled cargo. The names of the ships were blurred with age, but one was still legible, the Delilah Star, and Clara's heart skipped a beat because she had seen those initials before. DS, the same letters scribbled in the margin of Thomas Hale's last logbook entry. A visit to the old keeper's house. The original lighthouse keeper's home still stood at the edge of town, now converted into a small maritime museum. The volunteer on duty, an older man named Mr. Grady, had served as Hale's assistant for a short time in 1983. When Clara asked about the coded flashes, Grady leaned back in his chair and studied her carefully. "You've heard more than most visitors," he said. Tom was a good man, but there were nights. Well, nights where he stayed up long past the scheduled rotation. Not because of the weather. Clara pressed him for more, but he only added one final thing before changing the subject. If you're chasing this, you'll need to talk to the people who worked the docks back then. Not all of them will want to remember. If a story is in the records, it belongs to history. But if the records are gone, history belongs to whoever removed them. Clara Whitmore had been warned that finding the original lighthouse logbooks wouldn't be easy. Most were kept in the Ashford County Maritime Archive, a narrow, dimly lit room above the harbor office. The shelves smelled of salt and paper, each binder stamped with years in fading ink. She found the one she wanted. 198-41986. The first look flipping through the pages, Clara saw the daily entries. Weather reports, beam rotation checks, visitor logs. Every night was accounted for until she reached August 1985. The paper went from late August straight to September 3rd, an entire week missing. The same happened in February 1986, 2 full nights gone without explanation. And then, the most troubling gap of all. July 17th, 1986, the night Thomas Hale died. No entry, not even a blank page. It had been removed entirely. The binding marks. Clara leaned closer. She noticed the faint tear marks at the spine, a sign the pages had been cut, not fallen out on their own. Someone had taken them carefully. When she asked the archivist if the missing pages had been stored elsewhere, the woman shook her head. If they're gone, they were gone before we got the books. We keep them exactly as they're given to us, which meant the pages had been missing since at least the first archive transfer, over 30 years ago. An unexpected lead. Clara wasn't the only one in the archive that day. An older gentleman was seated at the far table, going through a stack of faded ship manifests. When she closed the binder, he glanced over. "Looking for the Hale records?" he asked. Clara paused. "Yes, you knew him?" The man nodded. "Worked the South Docks in the 80s. Used to watch the light with my night binoculars. I saw it change more than once. And I saw the Delilah star come in after." Clara felt the hair on her arms rise. "Do you remember the last night?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "I remember the light went out before the storm hit, and when it came back on, there was another boat in the harbor, one that never filed an arrival. The envelope. Before leaving, the man scribbled something on a piece of scrap paper. It was an address. This is where Grady's old friend lives. He kept some of his own records. If you're serious about this, you'll want to see them." The address wasn't in town. It was 40 miles inland. And if Clara was going to make that trip, she'd have to go soon. Word travels fast in a small place. The address Clara was given led her far from the ocean past pine forests, across narrow bridges, to a farmhouse set back from the road. The mailbox read, R. Maddox, Robert. Maddox had been a deckhand in the early 80s, and later a first mate on several long-haul fishing vessels. He had retired after an injury, but people in Ashford Point still remembered him as the one who saw too much. The first meeting. Maddox answered the door slowly, leaning on a cane. His eyes were sharp, and he seemed unsurprised to see a stranger on his porch. "You're the reporter," he said, not asking. "Grady told me you might come by." Inside, the air smelled faintly of salt and wood polish. On a heavy oak table sat a row of leather-bound journals, each marked with a year. The journal evidence Maddox opened one from 1985, flipping through until he found a page dated September 14th. There, in careful handwriting, he had drawn a map of the harbor. "See this inlet?" he said, pointing to a narrow curve behind the breakwater. "It's hidden, unless you know the angle. You can slip a small vessel in there without the harbor master seeing. But the tide's tricky. You'd need someone on shore giving you the all clear." He tapped the spot where the lighthouse beam would hit at night. A change in the flash pattern. That was the signal it was safe to enter. The pattern Clara asked how he could be so sure. Maddox replied without hesitation, "Because I saw it happen. And I saw the cargo being offloaded at night. Not fish, mind you. Crates, no labels, hauled straight into covered trucks." He leaned back in his chair. It wasn't constant, only every few months. And always the same ship, the Delilah Star. The night Hale died, when Clara asked about the summer of 1986, Maddox's expression changed. He grew quieter. That night was different. There was a storm coming in fast. The Delilah was nowhere on the horizon. But the light went out anyway. And when it came back, I saw a smaller boat slip in. Not the Delilah, something older. And then nothing. Next morning, they said Hale was gone. A hint of a larger game. Before she left, Maddox gave Clara a folded sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of a port schedule from 1985, with 2 dates circled. "Look into who was in town those nights," he said. "You might find this wasn't just about smuggling. Some of those crates weren't meant for Ashford Point at all." Clara tucked the paper into her bag. She now had more than rumors. She had a timeline and possibly a list of people who had been moving unseen through the harbor. Back in Ashford Point, Clara followed her next lead, one that came from a retired museum volunteer who remembered helping clear out Thomas Hale's old home after his passing. Most of his things went to the Maritime Archives, the woman had said, but there were boxes no one cataloged. "I think some ended up in his niece's attic." That niece still lived in town, and when Clara knocked on her door, she was more than willing to let her search. The attic was dim and smelled of cedar. Old quilts, framed photographs, and stacks of newspapers lined the walls. In the far corner, under a tarp, Clara found a battered wooden chest with a rusted latch. Inside, a faded lighthouse keeper's uniform, a pair of binoculars, and wrapped in oilcloth, a leather-bound notebook. The cover was scratched, but the name inside was clear: Thomas Hale. First glimpse into Hale's thoughts, the entries were unlike the official logbooks. They weren't technical reports, they were personal. Thoughts, worries, and notes about people in the town. On March 4th, 1985, Hale had written, "Grady says the flashes are being noticed. I told him I'm only doing what's required, but even I don't believe that anymore. Sometimes I feel the light is speaking for someone else." The entry before the end, the last dated entry, was July 16th, 1986, 2 days before Hale's death. "Delilah due next week," they said. "But why the urgency now? They came to me last night, 3 of them. Said I'd be given instructions before midnight. I don't like this. If I refuse, they'll replace me. But I've kept this light for 33 years. It's all I know." The handwriting was hurried, and in the corner of the page was a small drawing, a triangle over wavy lines, and beneath it, the letters DS hidden between the pages tucked inside the journal, was a folded letter. The paper was thin, the ink slightly smudged by moisture. It read, "Thomas, if the pattern changes twice in one night, it means we've been found out. In that case, leave the light dark until dawn. You'll be compensated." No questions. It was unsigned. A secret Hale never shared. Clara realized this letter had never been turned over to investigators, never entered into any official record. It was a direct link between the lighthouse signals and someone giving orders, someone who assumed Hale's loyalty. But who were they? And what was worth risking the entire harbor's safety to bring in unseen? Clara had 2 names circled in her notebook. People who had known Thomas Hale better than anyone else in town: Samuel Grady, his former assistant at the lighthouse, and Linda Carver, a retired harbor clerk who had handled ship logs for decades. She decided to speak to them back to back, starting with Grady. The meeting with Grady sat at a corner table in the cafe, his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. He didn't flinch when Clara placed the journal on the table. "I knew he kept notes," Grady said quietly. Didn't know he kept those. Clara slid the folded letter toward him. He read it twice, then let out a slow breath. That's not his handwriting. But I think I know whose it is. There was a man, never gave a last name, used to come by after dark. Always wore the same navy cap. Said he was from the shipping company. He and Hale would talk for hours in the keeper's quarters. Next morning, the flash pattern would be different. The harbor clerk's memory from the cafe, Clara walked to Linda Carver's small home overlooking the docks. Stacks of ledgers lined her living room walls. She pulled one from 1986 and opened it to the week of Hale's death. See here? Linda pointed. On the 17th, we had no official arrivals. But the dock ropes were wet the next morning. Ropes on slip 4, which hadn't been used in months. That means a vessel tied up during the night and left before dawn. Clara asked if she'd told anyone. Linda's answer was sharp. I told the harbor master. He told me to leave it alone. Connecting the dots with the journal, the letter, and the clerk's records, Clara now had 3 points of confirmation. The light pattern was changed intentionally. The changes matched secret vessel arrivals. On the night Hale died, a ship came in that was never logged. Grady leaned in as Clara recapped. If you want the truth, you need to talk to Captain Roy Hensley. He was out there that night. He saw who came in. And he's the only one still alive who might tell you. A name with weight. The name rang a bell. Hensley had been a respected fisherman until he left town abruptly in 1987. Some said he'd had a falling out with the shipping company. Others claimed he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. Either way, if Hensley was willing to talk, Clara might finally learn what or who had been on that unregistered vessel. Clara found Captain Roy Hensley living in a weathered cottage on the edge of the next county. The porch overlooked a narrow cove, and a single fishing skiff rocked gently in the shallows. When she introduced herself and mentioned Thomas Hale's name, Hensley's eyes narrowed, but he didn't turn her away. You want to know about that night? He said, then you'd better be ready to believe me. The storm rolls in Hensley had been out on his trawler on the evening of July 17, 1986. The forecast had warned of a sudden squall, so most boats had already returned to port. But Hensley had stayed late, anchoring just outside the breakwater to keep clear of the shallows. From there, he had a clear view of the lighthouse beam and of the harbor mouth. The light goes dark. The beam cut out just before midnight, Hensley recalled. That never happened unless there was damage or the keeper shut it down himself. No damage that night. 15 minutes later, he spotted movement of a small motor vessel approaching from the east. It had no running lights, just a faint glow from the wheelhouse. The quiet docking the boat slowed as it neared the hidden inlet behind the breakwater. A moment later, the lighthouse flashed twice in quick succession, a break from the standard 12-second sweep. That was the all clear, Hensley said firmly. I'd seen it before when the Delilah Star came in, but this wasn't the Delilah. He could make out 2 figures on deck 1 steering, 1 standing watch. When they reached the inlet, a 3rd figure emerged from the cabin and moved to the bow. I swear on my life, Hensley told Clara, that 3rd man was Thomas Hale. The last glimpse the vessel vanished into the inlet, hidden from view. Hensley stayed anchored until the storm broke over the harbor. By the time he returned at dawn, there was no sign of the mystery boat, and word had spread that Hale had been found dead in his chair. If you're asking me what happened in there, Hensley said, I can't tell you. But I can tell you this. He went willingly. And whatever they brought in that night, he didn't want it to reach the dock. A lead to the final answer, Hensley gave Clara one last clue. He'd kept a log of all vessels he'd seen that season, and the mystery boat from that night had markings, a faded emblem of a triangle over waves. The same drawing Hale had sketched in his journal. Clara Whitmore returned to Ashford Point with her notes, the journal, the letter, and the words of everyone who had dared to remember. It was time to assemble the truth. The final picture. On the night of July 17, 1986, a small, unregistered vessel approached Ashford Harbor. The lighthouse beam was extinguished intentionally, not for repairs, but to hide its approach. The two flashes that followed were the prearranged signal, safe to enter. But unlike previous nights, this vessel carried something, or someone, that Thomas Hale no longer wished to let pass unseen. A choice in the dark. Hale boarded the vessel in the inlet. Why? The journal hinted at pressure, threats of replacement if he refused to cooperate. But Hensley's account suggested something else, that Hale's presence on the bow meant he was taking control, perhaps trying to steer the vessel somewhere other than the hidden dock. What happened in the next hour remains unwritten, but when the light returned before dawn, the boat was gone, and Hale was back in the keeper's quarters, slumped in his chair. What the crates held theories spread for years: contraband, stolen antiques, even rare wildlife. But Clara's research into the shipping company's records revealed another possibility. The crates were bound for a coastal research facility that had quietly closed in 1987. No official cargo manifests were ever filed. Whatever was inside, it was meant to bypass customs entirely. A legacy protected in the end. Clara had no proof of what was in those crates, nor could she say for certain how Hale died. But the evidence suggested one clear truth. He was not simply a bystander in the smuggling. On his final night, he had acted, whether to protect the town, expose the scheme, or ensure the cargo never reached its destination. The town's decision. When Clara presented her findings at the town hall, there was no outrage, only a long, quiet moment of reflection. The townspeople chose to update the Lighthouse Museum's display, adding Hale's journal, a map of the harbor with the hidden inlet, and a simple plaque: Thomas Hale, keeper from 1953 to 1986. His light guided us home. His final night remains his own. Closing words: the Ashford Point Lighthouse still stands. Its beam sweeps across the harbor every 12 seconds, unchanging. But for those who know the story, each flash carries the memory of a keeper who may have given his life to keep the wrong ship from finding safe harbor. And in the end, that is a light that will never go out.